Okay, 12. Chapter 12, Assessing Neuromotor Balance and Design Programs. So some of the text, the ACSM uses neuromotor, uses that term. This text uses balance. One thing that I'll just add as a note is when I was looking at the the Hayward text, they dealt with mainly older individuals from a balance component, and I included things associated with your population, the general population, people my age. Definitely not people that particularly have balance problems. So I've added that information in there as well. So there's many different names that could fit into that category, and you'll see functional training, neuromotor training, balance training, plyometric training. They're different. They have nuanced differences, but a lot of times those terms are used interchangeably. So exercise typically incorporates some sort of skill component, which is the neuro aspect of it. So you can learn how to do the movement to a certain extent, and you need to learn how to do the movement, as well as it has a balance and a core component. You could also add it has a flexibility component as well often, but flexibility is covered elsewhere. Many exercises can overlap between the different categories, so you feel free to mix and match. Some exercises will definitely, if you do a single leg pistol squat, that will definitely count as a neuromotor balance exercise as well as a leg strengthening exercise. So feel free to mix and match. That way your time is used more efficiently. And use your knowledge and your discretion to a certain extent to categorize exercises. So, think about it. Does it include a balance component or not? So something like a bench press doesn't really include that much of a balance component. A bicep curl does not include that much of a balance component, as opposed to if you do the powerlifting exercises, squats, lunges. Lunges a little bit less so, but squats definitely they will include a level of balance and neuro associated with it. So feel free to mix and match. And as I mentioned, the book focuses on the elderly, and I try to address sport performance as well. So from the ACSM text, they give the definitions for neuromotor exercise. It's similar to what I wrote in the previous page. It involves motor skills. It has balance, coordination, gait, and agility, and proprioceptive training. It's sometimes called functional fitness training. And again, there's where the overlap occurs. Neuromotor exercise results in improvement in balance, agility, muscular strength, reduces the risk of falls, and fear of falling among older adults. But, a lot of times you guys are not worried about falling per se. You guys are worried more about working on balance and agility from a performance perspective, whatever activity that might be. Either you're trying to reduce risk of injury to try to have a well-balanced program, or you're trying to improve sport performance. Either way, it's going to be neuromotor exercise training. The optimal effects of the various types of neuromotor exercise, the dose, and they're looking at 2 to 3 days a week, exercise sessions 20 to 30 minutes. Again, the best thing to do is just have some exercises in your regular strength training program that have a neuromotor component. That way, you're most efficient on your time. They're looking at 60 minutes of neuromotor exercises per week. If you do specific agility training, that would fall into that category as well. Okay, so it just is what I stated before. Here's what the table in the ACSM text. I will go off of this table in the future as well. So if you're looking at the FITT aspects, frequency, intensity, time, type, volume, pattern, progression, I'm going to refer back to this slide. So 2 to 3 days a week. The intensity has not really been determined. 20 to 30 minutes per day. and it's the information that I stated before. So we all realize that neuromotor balance training is important. We haven't really been able to put a handle on putting parameters around it, but definitely it should be incorporated into the things that you do. And this is more from the Hayward text. So I put those two terms together, neuromotor and balance. It's just the ACSM text versus the Hayward text. It's an emerging trend. We're paying a lot more attention now to it than we did before. Components of functional fitness for the older adult, but for athletes, it's very important. It's very important for everybody in their daily lives to increase skill performance to a certain extent. We don't know what kind of effects that could have as we're aging. I would imagine that there is something there. It hasn't been quantified, or we don't particularly know, but I think if you don't have skill, certain levels of balance and skill as a young adult, your age or my age, then as you get older, your level of skill and your balance gets worse. If you have a higher level that you're starting from, then hopefully that decrease in skill will still let you be able to do your tasks of living with ease, as opposed to people that didn't have skill, didn't have balance. As they get older, they may have difficulties completing the basic tasks of daily living. Now that's my theory, but I think there's some logic and sense that goes with it. From an athletic performance, we want to increase skill as well as decrease the risk of injury. For the older individual, we're looking at preventing falls, performing activities of daily living, and maintaining functional independence. Being able to walk is the gait, balance and agility. So if you step off a curb or somebody nudges you, are you going to fall, or are you going to catch yourself? And then coordination and proprioception. So all three of those are pretty much going to go together, or they're going to go together. There's different types of balance. We have the static balance, that's me standing still, standing here. Dynamic balance, which would be you're maintaining your posture, but you're moving, so things like walking. Reactive, you trip or you get pushed. How do you regain your posture? How do you keep yourself from falling? And then the functional, which is probably an extension of the dynamic, so balancing while completing a complex movement. So it's the difference between walking and maintaining your posture versus incorporating upper and lower body movements, picking up an object from the floor. That's where you're combining different things. And we don't really think of the balance component associated with it, but there is a balance component and a coordination component. We kind of take it for granted. Things that affect balance. Again, your book, the Hayward text, addressed this from an older adult perspective. So I'm not a huge fan of some of the things that were said, and you kind of have to put it into perspective that that's what they're talking about. So height of center of gravity, the taller an individual is, that's going to affect balance. And generally from a balance perspective, the shorter individuals are going to have an advantage there. How much an advantage, I'm not quite sure. But you definitely see an advantage in gymnastics where balance is critical, that it definitely helps them perform those skills. However, if you're looking at something like obstacle course training, rock climbing, things like that, having height is beneficial. So it really just kind of depends on the sport and the movements you're trying to accomplish. They looked at the foot size. Larger foot can help, but I think the impact there is small. Gender impact, I'd say the impact of gender is fairly small as well. They're looking at static balance. There was no difference between men and women. You don't see men or women being more clumsy than the other, and I would say generally there's a lot of factors that are coming into play. Generally I'd say men are at an advantage. Doesn't mean that their balance is necessarily better, but they are at an inherent advantage because of the increased muscle mass, less fat mass. But there's going to be a lot of factors going on there, so I wouldn't say there's much of a factor really for any of them. when we're looking at physical activity and balance training, you could do sport-specific movements. That's going to help. That's where the specificity comes into play. Generally, improving the core is going to help. That's going to help from a injury reduction perspective as well, to help support those joint structures. Recruiting muscles in the correct order. This is basically learning how to do things. Some of this comes naturally to people, and that's what the genetics component is. That's what I talk about there. But to a certain extent, you can learn it as well. So the golf swing is a great example. To complete a golf swing properly is not easy, and you take a strength-trained individual and you put a golf ball down on the ground and you give them a club and they try to hit the ball. Usually they just use their shoulder and they're not turning their whole body. I don't know how well that showed up, but you just look at a golf swing and you just take a golf ball and golf club and film yourself if you're skilled or not skilled at it, and you can see what difference it is. You may be way stronger than that middle-aged man or woman who's playing golf their whole life, but because that middle-aged man or woman has learned how to recruit the muscles in the proper order, they basically learn how to do the movement properly. They're able to hit the ball a lot further, even though technically they're not as strong as somebody younger. So recruiting muscles in the proper order, that's going to be a big thing for the powerlifting movements as well, to really generate that force and be able to do the movement pattern proficiently. So, and that's why I talk about genetics. Genetics is not in the book, but some people naturally have it. You have people that are considered to be natural athletes. They're able to do the movement without much problem. But for other people, there's definitely a learned component. And I also think that for some people, you could try to learn it as much as you can. You're never going to be as good as some people where it's just innate. They just have those connections that are occurring in their mind and their body better than other people. And I use the example of intelligence. We can learn and we can try to study as hard as we can, but we're never going to be as smart as Einstein. We're never going to be as smart as some of the individuals at an Ivy League school, no matter how hard we try. And I would say the same thing is going to be true with athletics and balance and things like that as well. So the different measures, the book didn't talk about this, but I'm going to talk about this. We have the other video that goes over the functional movement screen. There's other things out there that can be done in athletic training. They have different things that they do as well. But for athletes in the general population, the functional movement screen is pretty popular, as well as evaluating the heck out of the overhead or deep squat. That's what Ron Dixon in the Strength and Conditioning, UTC Strength and Conditioning Center, that's what he likes to do. So there's different things that you could do to kind of figure out what kind of proficiencies an individual has in movement and what kind of deficits they might have. And some of those might be balance related, some of them may also be neuromotor related, and some of them can be flexibility related. So it's looking at all those, and a lot of times instead of just looking at balance, we're looking at movement. So how does it all work together? For the older adults, there are these tests, the Romberg test, Unipedal, stance test, reactive balance test, clinical test of sensory integration, modified Romberg test. For these tests, I don't really go over them. I'd have to look them up myself. Unipedal's obvious. That's just standing on one leg. But for a lot of these, if you do this with the general population, I did that Unipedal stance test many years ago with UTC students, and all the students could basically stand for 2 minutes on one leg without any problem at all. It was more of a surprise if you couldn't do it for 2 minutes. So the Unipedal stance test doesn't provide you with any information for the general population, and definitely for your age group. So a lot of times these tests for the older individual are geared towards that older individual and really don't have too much clinical significance to the general population, especially your age group. So what I say, and I did this with the aerobic exercise testing, is really what we need to do is develop a continuum, or when you're working with people, have a continuum of tests that you do to say, okay, if you're highly skilled, we're going to do these measures. If you're the general population, we do these measures. And if you're somebody that has deficits or you're concerned about significant deficits, then these types of tests that are listed here are going to be more appropriate. They have the Unipedal. I'll just switch kind of, yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious. You stand on one leg. Well, what I will say is this last line right here is the book mentions two things. They mention closing your eyes while doing the test. Closing your eyes definitely increases the difficulty of it. Personally, I would rather have the individual stand on a balance pad. This is you typically blue, about maybe 2 inches thick foam pad. And when you stand on that, it makes the surface more squishy, makes the surface softer, makes the surface more imbalanced, and it's harder to maintain your balance from that. The step up from that I did many years ago would be to stand on one leg on a Bosu ball, the domed side, standing on the domed side. That worked well as well. And what I did was, if you could do it for 2 minutes on the floor, then you went to the balance pad. If you do it on the balance pad, you went to the Bosu ball. You know, the argument is how important is Unipedal stance? How important is that type of balance? Most of the time, we're doing some sort of dynamic or complex level of balance. So, I mean, these tests are out there. What I will say is, when I trained an elderly woman, she had difficulty initially standing on one leg for even 5 to 10 seconds, and I think that's really where the Unipedal stance test becomes very important when people's balance is potentially very poor. Indirect measures, and there's going to be a couple pictures coming up. The functional reach test, the timed get up and go, the star excursion gait velocity. So this is the reach test. You stand on you stand and you bend forward, and they see how far you can bend forward. The get up and go, I think that's probably in the older population probably the most beneficial and telling, because it has that functional component. This is something that people will need to do, is to get up from a chair, and how quickly and with what level of agility can you do it. Is it relatively easy, like I'd expect it for everybody in this class, or does the person have difficulty, challenges doing that? And then this is probably the STAR test, probably the most appropriate and something that you guys could gain from. You do have to get that little pad there, or somehow devise that on the ground. But on one leg, you're trying to reach more and more forward with the opposite leg for a variety of different ankles. Excuse me. So that's going to help determine the level of balance that an individual has, and this can be challenging in your age group as well. So if you have the ability, you have that little pad, then this is something that may be reasonable to do. So the typical tasks include the typical tasks included in a balance test: batteries, maintaining posture, walking, rising from a seated position, transferring between chairs. Again, this is all stuff for people with severe, arguably severe disabilities. So the elderly, this would be appropriate for. Anybody that's not elderly, anybody that has some level of balance, it's really not going to tell you a whole heck of a lot, because we're all able to do this. Even if our fitness has decreased, and even if there's issues we need to address, these tests are going to look normal in the majority of the population. And this is where a more challenging test, like the functional movement screen, could give you more information. And these, again, tests that are more for the elderly population. So if you're working with the elderly, then you should look these up and you should learn them. But if you're not working with the elderly, they really are not something that you're going to particularly use. So I added this testing of athletes and the population in general. I've talked about this in the lab as well. Testing should have a specific purpose. You know, why the heck are you doing it? There should be a reason why you're doing things that you're doing. If there are norms for a test, then that is a better test to use. A lot of times, the things that you're interested in looking at, there are no norms. So if there's no norms, then there's no norms. You should develop those norms, at least for your own group of people. But generally speaking, if there are norms, you know, those are better tests to use, because then you can compare your person that you're working with to the general population to say, okay, your results are elite, your results are fair, poor, average, whatever the case may be. You may need to develop specific tests, especially if you're dealing with an athletic population or a specific sport, or you have a specific goal that you're trying to reach. There may be testing that you need to do to try to get at that specific skill. Develop your own norms over time. So you should collect data and you should somehow maintain that data set. And that's where I go to the last one. Try to keep some aspect of your testing the same between years. So everybody always does at least one test the same all the time. Even if you think that test is a little bit outdated or you've figured out something better, it's okay to do something better as well, but you should also do the older test. That way you could compare people over time. So that gives you that helps develop your data set, as well as looking at different testing modalities. At least there's something that you can compare people with. If you keep changing it, then it makes it difficult to compare people. They had direct laboratory methods of balance assessment. This was computerized force plates, similar to a Wii balance board, a souped-up version of that. They can change the angle of the board and look at how much pressure you're putting on your foot in various different ways. They look at postural sway and steadiness, weight distribution, and that's all fine and good. It gives the clinician some information, but for the most part, those things are expensive. I would say in the future, there's probably going to be cheaper versions that are more accessible to the general population. So things like the Wii balance board and video capturing devices like the Xbox camera, they're not the best right now, but I would imagine that they are going to get better and they're going to be more affordable, especially if you look 5 to 10 years down the road, especially 10 years down the road, which from your career perspective is relatively short. You know, I would imagine that these things will get less expensive and you can do more with it. You also have postural sway apps. So your phone has an accelerometer. So that's the device where if you're playing a game and you're moving the phone one way or another, it adjusts for it. But you could use that and put yourself in various positions that are difficult to maintain. Hold the phone close to you, and then it can measure how much sway or how much you're moving side to side to try to maintain that posture. So again, these are things that may not be highly available now, but definitely within the next 10 years, I would imagine there's more and more opportunities that are going to be there. The recommendation for balance training, I put this together for all ages, and then I put it together for the elderly. First, follow those ACSM guidelines that I went over in the beginning, and then individualize your program. Improve weaknesses. Is there something specific you're trying to address? Improve coordination. especially if you're trying to complete complex movements, whatever your goal is. If your goal is to throw a baseball faster with more velocity, then there's a certain movements and skill sets that you need to work on. For me, at my age, I don't really care. Sure, I want to throw a baseball or a football, and I want to put a little bit of zip on it, but did I throw a football 10 yards, 20 yards, or throwing a football 50 yards, it doesn't really matter to me. So, that's not something that I'm going to work on to a high level. But if that's something that's important, then that's something you work on. Improve the speed of the movement. That's the power, reaction time. And especially when you look at injury, doing things fast is where people get hurt. So being able to coordinate that and work on that a little bit can be important. Improve postural stability, especially when completing a complex movement. And this is where your core becomes important. For the older adult, when we're looking at balance, a lot of it can come down to resistance training, just getting stronger overall. So for the general populations, we're typically strong enough to do our tasks of daily living. We don't, specifically working on that is good, but it doesn't really change our ability to live our daily lives. For the older adult, it can. Stretching is important. Activities of strength and balance, like yoga, tai chi, dance, Pilates, completing functional movements, whatever that could be, getting up off the ground, getting into a car, putting away groceries, whatever that might be. And then neural training. It's not really mentioned in the book, so I guess I kind of made it up. But things like catching a ball, quick coordinated movements, easy sport movements. And when I think about this, I think about my mom. She's 74 years old. She definitely has some neurological deficits, balance deficits. Her balance has never been good throughout her lifetime. She's never been coordinated at all. And now she's starting to have some significant problems. My father, on the other hand, played sports throughout his life, was more active, did a lot more outdoor work than my mom particularly did, though they were both active. And for him, he doesn't really have the deficits that I see in my mom. And there could be a variety of reasons for that. But easy sport movements, I think, that's something that, again, can be incorporated with the older adult fairly easily. Kicking a ball. You don't have to kick it hard, but just that balance of standing on one leg and kicking it with the other leg, that's going to be good. Throwing a ball, catching a ball, hitting a tennis ball. It's not about becoming an athlete per se, it's but making those neural connections so that everything's able to work together, which is important. The exercise comments for balance for the general population, again, neuromotor included as well. Complete challenging movements with no to moderate amount of weight. This is about movement and this is about balance. This is not about lifting a heavy weight. This is about control of your movement. And therefore you should remediate or advance the skill as is appropriate. Make that thing more challenging, however that might be. Or make it easier if you're having significant levels of problems. So the point isn't you don't get a gold star by saying I did something that looks impressive, but really you did it with very poor form. This is about making sure the form is good and making sure that you're able to do it well. And if that means making the exercise a little easier, that's what you do. If it means that you've kind of mastered a certain skill set and now you're making it more challenging, then that's what you should do. To address the balance, you're increasing the level of imbalance you need to resist. So if you could do a pistol squat, then you could do a pistol squat holding a weight in the opposite hand. You could do something to make that imbalance more difficult for you to resist. Now, if you're not able to do the exercise well to start with, then you decrease the imbalance. But this is again where we're trying to make it more advanced and more difficult. So, if you're mastering skills, then we try to make it more and more challenging. Incorporate it into the resistance exercise program. I mentioned that previously. And complete strength, power, core movements. Complex strength, power, core movements will also count as balance and neuromotor exercises. So we're trying to be judicious with our time. We don't want to do an aerobic program, a flexibility program, a strength or resistance exercise program, and then a balance program. All of that takes a lot of time. So if we can mix and match some of these things, so much the better. Devices for balance training. You have balance discs, you have the foam pads, the Airx foam pads, you have rollers, stability balls, balance boards, the kettlebells. You have the computerized balance training systems. This would be like the Wii, the Wii balance board. This would be different things like that. Many devices can be found online. Powersystems.com or performbetter.com. You can also find a lot of things on Amazon. I'm not getting any money for recommending these websites, but there are a lot of websites out there where you can see these different training aids that are out there for a lot of different things. I mean, you have the ladders that'll go out on the ground, or you'll buy the little discs, the little cones that you could do drills around. There's a lot of different things that you can buy that help with training and can address balance and agility and things like that. So any of those things are potentially going to be fine.